I remember the moment the silence became louder than the bells. The vox grill in my private chamber hummed with absence, a void where the voice of segmentum command should have been. Each unanswered query, each delayed confirmation, rang like a verdict in the hollow chambers of my mind. Serenthos Prime had been entrusted to me, its manufactorums, its rivers of promethium, its citizenries and spires all my responsibility, yet now they moved under their own will, or no will at all. The factory sputtered and clanged to a halt, the streets whispered with unrest, and the chaplains, once the voices of his divinity, were mute. I walked the halls of my palace in robes that had once shone with imperial respect, now dulled by ash and the weight of dread. And in that suffocating quiet, I understood the simple truth the histories seldom record: failure in the Imperium is not forgiven. It is catalogued, observed, and consumed. And so I knelt alone, tracing the Aquila on my hands, feeling the cold press of inevitability, tasting the faint tang of iron in the stagnant air, knowing that my life as governor was over before any tribunal arrived. If you value journeys into the hidden truth of the Imperium, like, share, and subscribe. Here, the stories are not records of glory, but glimpses into the machinery of obedience and fear that keeps a galaxy of billions in line. Here, nothing is sanitized, nothing is comfortable. And yet, even in the darkest corridors of power, the lessons of failure echo louder than the proclamations of victory. I remember the exact moment when authority slipped through my fingers, though at the time I could not name it. The vox grill in my private chamber lay silent, a faint pulse of emptiness where the voice of segmentum command should have answered my queries. Each unanswered message felt like a soft verdict echoing through the vast halls of my palace. Serenthos Prime, a world I had once commanded with absolute certainty, now moved as though guided by some unseen hand, indifferent to my decrees. The manufactorums faltered first, the rhythm of industry stuttering, sparks scattering over soot-darkened floors as machines stilled in resignation. I walked through corridors that had once thrummed with order, my ceremonial robes dulled by ash and dust, and felt a growing void beneath my feet where power had once resided. The whispers began not in words, but in silences. Servitors passed with heads tilted unnaturally, their optics glazed, programmed to obey yet failing to respond. Clerks hesitated over data slates, fingers hovering above keys before retreating in silent panic. Rumors surged through the city faster than any decree I could issue: ration riots on the lower plateaus, sabotage in the manufactorums, reports of orc incursions once contained with a word now flaring unchecked. And I, the appointed steward of the Emperor's will, found myself powerless, a spectator in a theater of my own failure. Nights were worst of all, when the ash-laden winds carried the soft clamor of citizens retreating into hidden warrens. Their doubts hung thick in the air, questioning not only my leadership but the gaze of the God Emperor himself. I could feel his absence pressing down upon me, cold and indifferent, heavier than promethium smoke or the weight of my own robes. Prayer offered no solace. Chaplains had vanished or remained silent, their canticles failing to answer the rising tide of uncertainty. I knelt before the altar in the dim glow of dying embers, tracing the imperial Aquila on polished stone. The metal felt cold, lifeless, a reflection of the emptiness within. My whispered prayers dissolved into the echoing halls, swallowed by shadows, unanswered and unnoticed. I began to understand the stark truth of my position: failure in the Imperium is not forgiven. It is observed, catalogued, and ultimately consumed. The fear that gnawed at my mind was not for my own life alone but for the message it would send, that even those closest to Terra are disposable when found wanting. Each message I sent into the void became a confession of inadequacy. Decrees returned unsigned or ignored, guards appeared only partially, uncertain in their obedience. And gradually, the city itself seemed to whisper against me. Shadows flickered where none should exist, reflections of soldiers I did not summon appearing in the polished stone. Sometimes I told myself it was paranoia, the stress of isolation bending perception, but then came the signals I could not deny: faint vox pulses not meant for me, subtle shifts in the city's rhythm, the quiet pressure of observation pressing on my consciousness. The planet itself seemed to judge me, cataloging my errors, weighing my worth, anticipating my fall. I clung to the hope that a single act of compliance or a deftly crafted decree could reverse the tide, but deep down, I knew the machinery was already in motion, indifferent to my intentions or loyalty. I would walk the corridors at night, hands trailing over the Aquila rings on my fingers, grounding myself in the memory of authority I once wielded. The halls reeked of ash and soot, distant fires in manufactorum sending the faint tang of burning promethium through cracked windows. Every breath carried the metallic taste of fear, every step reminded me that control had slipped entirely. And as I sank to the cold stone floor, alone, listening to the whispers of a city that had once obeyed, I understood the cruelest lesson of all: the Imperium moves on, and there is no reckoning for those it leaves behind. Not with fanfare, not with accusation, only with the quiet, inexorable certainty that my life as governor had ended long before the tribunal would arrive. Sleep became a stranger. Even when my eyes closed, the shadows of the palace did not recede. I saw the faces of citizens I had once passed with nods and polite acknowledgement, now etched with suspicion, fear, and quiet accusation. Their gazes seemed to follow me through every hall, and I could not tell if they judged me, pitied me, or merely mirrored the inevitable collapse I sensed in my own bones. The corridors of power, once resplendent with imperial banners and the hum of orderly machinery, had transformed into a labyrinth of unease. The torchlight flickered over stone, casting shapes that mocked the symmetry of governance. Every crack in the walls, every streak of soot, whispered the same truth: authority without obedience is a hollow illusion. Reports from the lower plateaus grew darker with each passing cycle. Rioters had torched ration depots, and mechanized transport lines failed without explanation. Even the orc warbands that roamed nearby seemed bolder, probing defenses that once required only a gesture from my command to repel. That I tried to summon the Planetary defense forces through the data slates, but the messages returned as fragments, garbled and incomplete, or were ignored entirely. It was as if the planet itself conspired to reveal the futility of my authority, a vast organism rejecting the hand that once directed it. The realization was suffocating: I was no longer governor. I was a witness, a participant only in name, powerless while the world bled around me. The few remaining clerks avoided my gaze, lips pressed tight, their faces pale beneath the dim glow of emergency lighting. Their hesitation was a mirror to my own panic, yet more disciplined, more controlled. They understood what I feared to admit: my failure had become a contagion, and proximity to it was dangerous. Even my advisors, once loyal, now spoke only when spoken to, their words measured and careful, like fragments of a language meant to placate unseen arbiters. I began to notice the subtle signs of observation: unmarked servitors stationed at corners, silent witnesses in chambers I had long considered private. The palace itself had become a tribunal, each stone a witness, each shadow a record of my shortcomings. Hunger and exhaustion joined the chorus of dread. Meals left untouched, the taste of boiled rations lingering on my tongue, reminding me of the fragility of life and the transience of privilege. Every heartbeat, every breath, was a reminder that I was no longer sovereign here. I was an object catalogued for eventual correction. And yet, I persisted in ritual, tracing the imperial Aquila on my hands, murmuring prayers to a god-emperor who did not answer, counting the rings on my fingers as though their weight could anchor me to relevance. The cold stone pressed into my knees, grounding me physically even as authority fled from every fiber of my being. Faith was not comfort, it was a question, a trembling hope that perhaps observation alone was not a sentence. Then came the first unmistakable sign: a message in code, transmitted not to my secure Vox channel but intercepted in the palace's peripheral network. It was a simple line of data, almost innocuous in its brevity, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. The words were not addressed to me but about me: Governor flagged for immediate extraction. Non-compliance confirmed. Prepare for assimilation. Assimilation. A sterile, clinical term for unmaking a man who had once commanded fleets and legislated famine. My pulse accelerated, not in panic but in grim understanding. The Imperium had seen the calculus, weighed my failures, and decreed the outcome. I was a variable, no longer a governor, now an asset to be corrected, reshaped, or removed entirely. No tribunal, no appeal, no miracle would intervene. The machinery of the Imperium was indifferent, and my life had become a lesson in inevitability. As I sank to the floor once more, I felt the first real flicker of fear, not for pain, not for death, but for the erasure of existence itself. I had been a governor, a conduit of imperial will, a figure of authority whose signature could bend lives. And now, I was a shadow, a subject of observation, a man catalogued and measured before being rewritten into irrelevance. The palace walls, once grand and echoing with the certainty of law, now pressed inward, heavy with ash and silence. The world outside continued its slow revolt, indifferent to my despair. And I, kneeling in the dim glow of emberlit corridors, understood for the first time that failure was not just a personal shame, it was a sentence that stretched far beyond the individual, a reminder to all who witnessed it of the relentless, uncompromising nature of the Imperium. The corridors no longer felt like halls of governance, they were cages, and I the prisoner of my own inadequacy. Even the palace air seemed conspiratorial, thick with the lingering scent of soot, burnt promethium, and the faint, metallic tang of blood I could not place. Every footstep echoed too loudly, a drumbeat of impending reckoning, and shadows lengthened in impossible angles across the stone floors. I began to avoid the main chambers, retreating to side halls where the faint hum of machinery could mask my presence, yet even there the whispers followed me. The servitors stationed at corners or behind columns moved with silent vigilance, optics flickering with awareness. I could feel them cataloging my movements, every hesitation, every misstep. The world had become a tribunal, and I was already guilty. I remembered the reports I once dismissed as exaggerations, riots in lower plateaus, sabotage in manufactorums, murmurs of heresy among the populace. Each event had seemed isolated, manageable, until the threads began to weave together into an unbroken tapestry of revolt and disorder. Now, each day brought news more dire, more unrelenting. Supply lines failed, communication grids flickered and died, and the few loyalists remaining clutched at my commands with trembling hands, unsure whether obedience would protect them or merely mark them for scrutiny. My own voice, once commanding and absolute, now sounded hollow even to my ears, reverberating against empty chambers and stone walls, bouncing back as accusation. Sleep remained impossible. The shadows grew restless, taking forms that my mind insisted were not real, yet I could not shake the feeling of being watched beyond the machinery, beyond the walls. Sometimes I imagined the eyes of the Emperor piercing through the void, indifferent, calculating, weighing my failures in silence. I recited prayers, not for salvation, but as a test, seeking some response in the cold stone of the palace altar. Each prayer dissolved into the emptiness above, unanswered, leaving only the echo of my own inadequacy. Even the Aquila rings on my fingers, polished and heavy with ceremony, seemed to mock me, the weight of responsibility they had once symbolized now pressed down like a leaden reminder of all I had lost. Hunger gnawed at me in quiet fits, yet it was not the primary torment. Food tasted like ash and iron, every morsel a bitter reflection of my diminished station. I began to notice subtle changes in my reflection, in the way my own eyes betrayed exhaustion and fear. The meticulous image of command, cultivated over decades, was cracking. Every gesture, every thought, seemed observed and measured against standards I could no longer control. My advisors avoided me, their careful distance more damning than confrontation, their silence louder than any accusation. Even the city itself seemed to turn against me, its streets moving with a rhythm I could not dictate, its citizens whispering doubts I could not correct. Then came the unmistakable signal of finality, a silent, coded pulse across the peripheral networks, one I could not intercept or redirect. It was the announcement of a verdict already rendered, a quiet yet inexorable command to remove me from my post. I felt the cold clarity of inevitability settle in my chest. I was no longer a governor. I was a subject of observation, catalogued and marked for unmaking. There would be no tribunal, no witnesses, no chance for appeal. The Imperium had calculated the error, weighed my usefulness, and decided. My life had become a cautionary tale before it ended, a demonstration of the machinery of obedience that kept worlds in line. I was powerless, reduced to a single truth: failure is not forgiven, it is erased. Kneeling once more, I traced the Aquila on my hands for the last time, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingertips. The flicker of ember light in the chamber cast long shadows, stretching across stone floors that had witnessed decades of order, now echoing only my despair. My mind wandered to rumors whispered in distant voidfarers' tales, the unrecorded, erased governors whose existence had been expunged from history, remembered only by fragments of memory and prayer. Perhaps, I thought bitterly, that would be my fate, to be catalogued, erased, and whispered of only as a warning. The palace walls, heavy with ash and silence, bore down, and I understood fully the terrifying weight of failure in the Imperium. To err is not merely to die, but to vanish, leaving no trace of self or influence, a lesson written in the language of fear for all who follow. The morning after the first pulse of finality, the palace felt stranger than ever. Light filtered through ash-streaked windows, but it carried no warmth, only the gray pall of inevitability. Servitors moved through corridors with clockwork precision, but their eyes, cold lenses of observation, betrayed the purpose behind each measured step. They were cataloging me, noting every hesitation, every tremor of fear, as though the very act of breathing might be recorded in a dossier I would never see. I had expected punishment, perhaps even confrontation, but the Imperium's approach was far subtler: extraction without ceremony, unmaking without spectacle, an erasure both administrative and psychological. Titles and honors were stripped from data slates before I could lift a finger to defend them, and decrees I had spent cycles perfecting vanished as though they had never existed. I wandered the palace halls, a ghost among the living, noting the subtle changes that marked my fall. Advisors no longer approached me, their words carefully measured, their tones neutral, their eyes flicking to the shadows as if seeking approval from a tribunal beyond my perception. Even the palace machinery seemed altered, data slates hummed with fragments of messages I could not decode, systems designed to serve my command now functioning autonomously, ignoring requests, redirecting orders, reinforcing the sense that the planet itself had decided I was surplus. And through it all, the citizens of Sorrento's Prime whispered rumors of a governor who no longer governed, tales that spread faster than fire through the lower plateaus, feeding fear and uncertainty. My authority had become irrelevant, my presence more of a warning than a guidance. The first of the removals began with the clerks. They came silently, appearing where I did not summon them, moving with a precision that betrayed their purpose. Files, personal items, even private records were seized with methodical efficiency. It was not punishment, it was erasure, the quiet reorganization of history to fit the Imperium's narrative. I could not stop it, nor would anyone attempt to. Every object removed, every record vanishing from existence, reinforced the lesson: failure is not merely punished, it is obliterated. My own life, once the measure of loyalty and diligence, now served as a tool, a demonstration of what the Imperium demanded and how it dealt with transgression. I became an observer of my own disassembly, a governor stripped of not only power but identity, catalogued for the imperatives of obedience. Faith, once a source of solace, twisted into another instrument of torment. The chaplains, silent for cycles, returned in brief, measured intervals to update vox canticles, to remind the population that divine oversight continued, yet never offered guidance to me. The ecclesiarchy's ministrations were absent where they were needed most, leaving me to face the process of extraction in isolation. I began to see their absence not as neglect, but as deliberate design. The Imperium's judgment was not meant to be mitigated by spiritual comfort, it was intended to be absolute. My prayers echoed into empty chambers, dissolving into the cold air, unanswered, as though even the Emperor himself had withdrawn observation, leaving me exposed to the machinery of correction. Isolation intensified the psychological toll. Food was delivered mechanically, cold rations placed at my door with no acknowledgement. Sleep remained elusive, haunted by the knowledge that every word, every movement, would be measured, recorded, and interpreted. Servitors flanked the doorways of private chambers, their optics tracking, their mechanical limbs ready to intervene, but they never spoke. Even when no one approached, I could feel the scrutiny, the quiet, relentless cataloging that transformed every breath into a statement of obedience or failure. The walls themselves seemed to shift, bearing silent witness to my unraveling, heavy with ash and soot, holding within them the memory of a man who had once commanded absolute loyalty, now reduced to a subject of bureaucratic and spiritual erasure. Rumors, subtle but insistent, began to circulate among the remaining palace staff, whispers of extraction teams, of distant inquisitors dispatched to confirm compliance, of mechanicus oversight that would ensure the erasure was total. The planetary archives, once meticulously maintained under my guidance, were altered in secret, histories rewritten to remove my influence, reshaped to fit the Imperium's desired narrative. I understood, with growing horror, that my life was no longer my own. I was a variable in a system that demanded perfection, obedience, and unquestioning loyalty, and the cost of deviation was not debate, nor trial, but systematic annihilation of identity. Every familiar corridor, every hall once echoing with certainty, now pressed in with oppressive certainty, reminding me that the Imperium's correction was meticulous, unemotional, and inevitable. The second day of erasure began not with sound, but with absence. The Palace Vox network, once alive with layered reports and ritual confirmations, had been muted. No alerts, no transmissions, no access. Silence in the Imperium is never peace, it is a verdict delivered without words. I walked past terminals that once lit at my authorization and saw only dormant glass, opaque and unresponsive, as if the machines themselves had been instructed to forget I ever commanded them. Even the walls felt different, the air held no memory of urgency, only the sterile stillness of a mausoleum for living men. It was then that the first custodial detachment arrived, not custodian guard in gold, but the cold administrative equivalent, 3 robed archivists of the administratum accompanied by a pair of silent Scutarii escorts whose visors glowed with that dead teal light of unerring judgment. They did not speak. They simply entered my private archive, sealed it from within, and began the process of excision. I stood in the corridor, forbidden to enter my own sanctum, listening to the faint scratch of styluses, the mechanical clatter of data extraction assemblies, the methodical reshaping of history. I realized, with a visceral heaviness, that they were not merely recording, they were rewriting. Not preserving my failure, but designing a version of events in which I never existed. The Scutarii stood like iron statues, weapons idle but reality unquestionable, force was ready, should I resist the rewriting of my own legacy. Resistance would not result in trial or speech or chance, only termination, clean and bureaucratic, the kind of death that leaves not even a rumor behind. I understood then why most governors broken by failure do not scream, do not flee, do not plead. There is no audience for defiance when one is already being removed from narrative. By midday, the atmosphere had thickened with the suffocating stench of inevitability. Workers who once bowed at my approach now averted their eyes, as though looking upon me risked contagion. Even those loyal to me by oath walked differently, steps light, shoulders drawn inward, bodies angled away. They were not afraid of me, they feared proximity to a man the Imperium had decided must be forgotten. There is a terror far greater than death in this regime, becoming a cautionary absence, the kind of void people learn from without ever naming. In the late hours, the ecclesiarchy returned, not to console, not to guide, but to recite a liturgical formula over the palace vox. It was brief, without warmth or human timbre, a machine-transmitted canticle declaring that order is restored, deviation has been corrected, the Emperor's design is intact. No names, no accusation, no narrative, because a crime without a name leaves no martyr, no inspiration, no memory. The correction was complete enough for them to begin ritual sealing, but not yet final. The execution of identity must always finish before the execution of flesh. What unnerved me most was not the administrative dissection, nor the ecclesiarchy's ritual affirmation, but the posture of the world below. Through the balcony windows I saw crowds gathered in the dust-choked courtyards, not rioting, not praying, not pleading, simply watching the palace in silence. They understood instinctively what had begun. The Imperium does not need to tell its people when a governor has failed, the quiet suffices. Fear teaches faster than proclamation. The crowd stood there like mourners without the right to grieve, knowing the shape of what would follow without daring to speak it. Night fell without ceremony. I attempted to sleep, but sleep had become a sounding chamber for dread. I imagined the archivist still at work, deleting me line by line from the tapestry of record. I imagined the Skitarii standing guard not over documents, but over the borders of memory itself. I imagined the ships in orbit, their guns idle but fueled, waiting to erase not just me but the world if the erasure of one man proved insufficient. There is a moment, when one stands on the edge of obliteration, in which the mind searches for any justification, any crack through which to escape the logic of punishment. I found none. There was no appeal to terra, no tribunal, no doctrinal clause, no mercy. The Imperium does not punish failures. It removes them. Completely. Neatly. Without echo. And beneath that realization, colder than fear, sharper than shame, came a new and final one. If they were already erasing me from existence before I died, then the manner of my physical end would not be public, not recorded, not remembered. My death would not even be considered an event. I would disappear the way lights go out during a power loss, abruptly, silently, without remark.